Hey guys, so I decided to do this meta tier list by the data just before the Ishizu tier format starts because, well, we already know tiers are the best deck right now and will be for the foreseeable future anyways, and I have another meta analysis video in mind for next week post Magnificent Mavens, so stay tuned for that. And before I continue, big thanks to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes below. As usual, you can always check my first tier list video on how I use Dueling Book data from YGeoscope to calculate the score, and for this month, we'll be using top cut representation from YCS Minneapolis to calculate component C of the formula. As usual, some comments on data quality. The main one to note is that for branded Despia, I had always relied on just branded to represent this deck, although I did have to adjust down the counts because not all branded decks are Despia. But this time I had to adjust it down significantly more by 75% because now there's too many tiers and bestial variants running branded that it was just inflating the counts way too much, and I had to make an adjustment to get it back down to that tier 2 level. Then there's a few of many decks that cannot be identified by YGeoscope currently, such as Rika, Exo Sisters, and Marinces, and make sure to check my recent Marinces deck profile with the player who is currently ranked in the top 20 on Dueling Book with it. So starting with tier 1, to no one's surprise, it is Tearlaments, and this disparity will get even greater in just a few days after the Ishizu cards become legal. Just absolutely overpowered strategy that for some reason got even more support in Darkwing Blast that made it noticeably better with Rockalos as well as the new spells, and now the Ishizu cards will get them even to higher levels. Here's to hoping Konami will implement an emergency ban list if they end up being as strong as most people predict. Coming second is also no surprise, and that is Spright. Now before Darkwing Blast, right after the ban list, Spright was actually holding its ground very well against tiers due to the runic package, but now it has become a very clear second place. Still a strong deck, and on Dueling Book, its variants actually saw more total play than tier variants, and also winning 60% of matches in the last 7 days is insane. A lot of top cut representation in Minneapolis as well, although let's see how this looks at YCS Pasadena this weekend. At third is the best anti-meta strategy at the moment in Floowandereeze, where the dimension shifters will help combat against Tearlaments, although Ishizu tiers will be running 3 orange holds to negate it, so it's not a fail-safe thing if you draw it now. The win percentage in the last 7 days at 61% is insane, and it also got some YCS tops as well, so don't sleep on this deck. Then at the last of tier 1 is Dragon Link making its strong return after completely disappearing in the last month's tier list. With the release of bestial cards, this deck can run the package best, and bestials just happen to be able to hit the top decks in tier and sprites, not to mention numerous rogue strategies. It got a YCS top as well at Minneapolis, and probably will get a bit more moving forward. Coming in at tier 2, we start off with Sword Soul, the quickly forgotten meta deck that is still hanging around, although sadly no YCS top recently. A fair and consistent deck, it is quite solid at both going first and second, and with the recent reprints in Magnificent Mavens, the deck has become more affordable. Then we have a surprise factor in Thunder Dragons placing this high, and this is mainly because of its YCS top that increased its tier score quite a bit. Now it remains to be seen whether it can continue this success after the release of Bestials, and I believe it got another top at the Luxury Tournament. Really cool to see this deck back, although of course in a completely different strategy than what it once was with Colossus. Next we have branded Despia, which as I mentioned earlier in the video, I did have to reduce its count quite a lot to avoid counting other branded variants, which are rampant at the moment. Another quickly forgotten deck in the recent months, it did get some new support cards, and the Disciple Rawlock is pretty nasty and can steal games. Sadly, Guardian Chimera is still an expensive card, but most of the other cards in the deck have gotten reprints lately. Then we have a deck that fell out pretty hard since the last month, and that is Mathmech. And again, the reason for the fall in play online and in IRL events is because of the release of bestial cards. It has a good matchup against Sprite, but from what I heard, does not fare too well against tiers. Enzo Central on Dueling Book is still killing it with this deck, and make sure to check my interview with him on my channel. Then we have Heroes, which honestly is a rogue deck, and originally I thought they scored this high because of potentially other decks that may be running the DP package again and being mistakenly categorized as Heroes. But I've been looking at a lot of deck lists lately, and you really don't see the DP package being run much in other decks, and I think Heroes is just a popular deck, especially online. Its win percentage at 45% was pretty bad, and again as a common theme, the bestial cards are quite detrimental against heroes as well. Rounding off tier 2 is Mystic Mind Burn, which I'm a bit confused about, not sure what caused this increase in play recently. Maybe people just got so fed up with tier this format that they decided to start trolling and play Mystic Mind Burn, and as much as I hate the card, I almost don't really blame them because we may be entering a pretty dull format. Starting us off in rogue tier is Brigade, which along with the Sprite engine has been really quite solid. With the Ishizu stuff coming right around the corner, I guess they would be able to trigger them when Brigade monsters are milled, although I don't know how their matchup is actually like against tiers. This was a really fair deck back in its tier 1 days and will probably be decent for years to come. Then we have a fan favorite in Salami Angry, which actually came day 2 at YCS Minneapolis, and you can check my deck profile on the list on my channel that I posted recently. The deck can make Baguska or Dweller pretty easily, which is pretty handy this format, and their counter trap paired with it can be a nice combination. Its win percentage in the last 7 days at 45% wasn't so hot though. Next we have Draco Slayers, the new cards from Darkwing Blast. Technically this is identified as Pendulum Magicians on YGO Scope, but obviously this is the deck that it is referring to. The sudden rise in the play of pendulums is actually kinda refreshing to see, and it will be interesting to see if the deck actually sees more play, or if this is more so because of the initial hype of its release. The 48% match win percentage isn't great, but not terrible, and hopefully these numbers go up as players become more experienced with the new strategy. Then we have another fan favorite in Sky Strikers, which sadly has now fallen off from its tier 2 status and had a pretty miserable showing at 40% match win percentage. The deck got a lot of reprints in the Magnificent Maven set, along with some new cards like Linkage. I recently did an interview with Rose, who usually ranks high with Sky Strikers, so feel free to check that out as well. Next we have Elitch, which has been in the Rogue tier for recent months now. Again, due to the Bestial cards, this actually hampers Elitch a lot since it's mostly in the grave and looking to come back. With decks usually running 2 Elitch, banishing both just means an absolute end to their game plan. Even Skill Drain may not be as impactful now since the new cards like Fenrir and Bestials are big bodies that you can summon for free. Then we have Ignister that has been in the Rogue tier for a while now, and there are some well-known players on Dueling Book who always ranks high with this strategy. Has had some YCS success recently and is definitely a solid deck, and some decks just aren't going to have an out to arrival at Ignister. Next we have Dinosaurs, and this is technically including Dinomorphia values as well. Did well in the last 7 days with a 53% match win percentage, and I believe the more popular way to play this deck is the Scrap Dino variant, but until Mist comes off at more than one, any variant will be Rogue sadly. Lastly, in the Rogue tier we have Virtual World, been falling off more and more lately, although its win percentage at 55% is actually really good. At least the Virtual World monsters are Earth or Wind, so I would assume that the Bestial stuff doesn't really mess with this deck for the most part. And lastly, in the other category, we see Drytrons falling off hard from its tier 2 status last month to here. Obviously as a deck, this strategy is certainly more competitive than some of the decks listed in Rogue, but at the same time, the Bestial cards really messed this deck up, so I can see why it dropped so hard, mainly stemming from players just choosing not to play it anymore online. Perhaps this is why Konami decided to let them have Benton back to 3. Finally, we end the tier list with Punk, which honestly doesn't see much play at all, whether online or in IRL events, even though briefly after its new support, it was seeing some competitive play. Obviously that changed when Hulk and Chaos Ruler got banned, but at least the deck still seems to be playable, although this may be more so representative of using it as an engine still somehow. Alright guys, so that was it for the tier list by the data for this month. I have another data video in mind to break down the meta post Ishizu support, so stay tuned for that. As always, a big thanks to my Patreons Eileen Dice Queen, Bolt Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Barrelord, Spooky Boogie, Stephen Phillips, and Chaz Blanks as always for supporting the channel. You guys are great. If you're interested in joining my Patreon, link down below. Take care guys.